Good evening, darlings and deviants. My name is Lucy and I'm just a little loony. Due to the aforementioned looniness, I have opinions that I think would lock me up in the interplanar gulag, but nevertheless I feel the need to share on the internet. For example, a certain cycle of competitive corrupting creatures is creeping into my mind space as of late, so I wanted to make a whole video out of them. That's right, I love companions. This mechanic is super fun and allows for some really interesting deck building challenges for some of your favorite commanders. Statement. My data records indicate a heavily complicated history and several changes to the rules pertaining to the cycle of cards notated as companions. Query. Why do you enjoy partaking in a mechanic that has caused structural damage to the game? Yeesh, yeah, Companions had a bit of a rough start, but after rotating out of Standard and being essentially banned out of every relevant constructed format with the recent ban of Gigantha from Modern, rest in peace Jeggy, the only place for Companions nowadays is Commander. Today I want to talk about Companions, some cool commanders you can use with those Companions, and how some more Companions could potentially be made in the future. Yes, I want more Companions, and no, Jeggy does not have me at gunpoint right now. Without further ado, let's start the show. Okay, so before I nerd out about Companions, let's do a little bit of history. Ikoria released in April of 2020, and already that throws a lot of red flags up. 2020 was certainly the year of all time, and Ikoria being the first set release post-lockdown after a pandemic was certainly a rough start. In addition to Mutate and Cycling, we also got Companions. These adorable critters started outside of your deck, and you could cast them for free from there once per game. In Commander, they can be a 101st card, but in other constructed formats like Standard, Modern, and Pioneer, they were a part of your sideboard and were essentially a free 8th card in your opening hand. If that sounds more broken than your average opponent's draft deck on Arena, then you'd be right. Turns out, getting a free card to cast is pretty awesome, especially if you don't have to really do too much to slot the companion into your deck. One of the biggest problems with these cute companions is that deck building restrictions for some of them weren't exactly restrictions. For example, Lurrus, Gigantha, and Kahira were way too easy to build around, and Zirda only needed permanents to have activated abilities, so that made an instant and sorcery-heavy format like Legacy easy pickings. The others were a bit more difficult, but they still saw some form of constructed play, so Wizards had to go back to the drawing board. On the 1st of June in 2020, not even 2 months after the initial release of the set, the mechanic got reworked. Now, instead of casting them from the Companion Zone, you need to pay 3 mana at sorcery speed to put it into your hand, and then you get to cast it for its mana cost. Still good, but not absolutely broken. Well, after this change, we still saw multiple Companions get banned in multiple formats. Lutri was banned in Commander the day it was spoiled, Zirda was banned in Legacy, Gigantha, Kahira, and Yorion were all banned in Modern, and Lurrus got banned in Pioneer, Modern, Legacy, and Explorer. As a reminder, these bans were all with the extra tax in place as well. Companions were just that good. And I think they're still good. The restrictions are kind of made for Commander. When you have a normal playset of 4 apiece, it gets a lot easier to kind of negate some of these, but in Commander we only get 1 of each card, so the restrictions are a lot more, well, restrictive. In addition, the effects are really interesting, and I love these cards to death. So let's take a look at all of them. Specifically, we're going to take a look at these in Commander. I don't want to try to get any of these banned in other competitive formats. I don't want the spikes coming to break my kneecaps. I need those. Okay, so we're going to go in Wooburg order, but just to get ahead of the comments, I'm going to be skipping Yorion and Lutri. While I would love a way to play Yorion in Commander, and I'm part of the #free Ottermom movement, they're still both unplayable right now due to those conditions. While I know you can technically play Yorion with the Unknown Event card, Covert Blue Mage, I don't think it's worth talking about Yorion as anything other than a commander, and it's just kind of a generic blue-white blink strategy on its face, and there's some cooler options than just, you know, a flyer that blinks your board. So moving on, that starts us off with... Well, luckily, Lurrus isn't nearly as busted as she is in other formats. Lurrus is 1 and 2 white-black hybrid mana for a 3/2 Cat Nightmare with lifelink and the ability to let you cast 1 permanent spell with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard once per turn. This will come in handy because our deck building restriction is all of the permanent spells in your deck must have a mana value of 2 or less, including your commander. That's an important thing to note moving forward. Each of these companions also needs to gel with your commander, or else they won't really get along outside of the game. So now we're looking at commanders with both white and black in their color identity, while also being a bit synergistic with the theme of permanents with mana value 2 or less, and also being mana value 2 and less in and of themselves. Shockingly, we have a few options. If we want to play 5-color nonsense, Ezio Auditore da Forenza from the new Assassin's Creed Universes Beyond sets lets us play all of the colors and therefore some of the best cheap 2-mana cost cards available. And while that's really funny, I think I'd rather have a more synergistic commander to go with Loris, and there's not really that many cheap assassins like that. There's a few options still, and I think my favorite of the bunch is McCready, Lamplight Mare from the Fallout set. He's a white and a black for a 1/3 human advisor who makes our creatures that attack with power 2 or less gain Skulk, meaning they can't be blocked by creatures with a greater power, and makes the controller of creatures with power 4 or greater lose 2 life when they attack us, and if that's not cool enough, we also gain 2 life whenever that happens. As for cheap permanents to include, you can be as serious as playing cards like Dark Confidant and Draenith Magistrate, or you could put in cards like Heir Apparent and have an ever-increasingly large bunny army. Finally, just remember that it's only permanent spells that need to have that cost of 2 or less. Your instants and sorceries can be as expensive as you'd like. Not only does this mean your removal is a-okay, but cards like Silver Quill Command and Raise the Past can be played, letting you revive those small creatures that you have in your deck. Luris might have been the scourge of Constructed, but it's a pretty cool option for decks nowadays. Not the most powerful in Commander and a pretty heavy restriction, but hey, at least you can still play Sol Ring. Time to activate your deck building brains for Zerda the Dawnwaker. She's a 3/3 for 1 generic mana and 2 white-red hybrid mana with a pretty restrictive companion effect. Every permanent card in your deck has to have an activated ability. Oddly enough, this means you can't get cheeky and run lands like Urborg or Yavimaya, but more realistically, you can't play Urza's Saga since it doesn't start with an activated ability. But the ability you get as a trade-off is insane. Zerda makes all of your activated abilities cost 2 less, but no less than 1. No free rides here. Zerda can also tap and pay 1 to make a creature unable to block, but that's not as important as the awesome passive effect. Just like with Luris, the deck building restriction is rough, but since it only affects permanents, it's not too bad. And it still lets you run most of the mana rocks that a Boros deck wants to play. However, your creatures might get a little bit more awkward to plan around, which makes the commander for this cutie a bit more selective. One of the more obvious picks is Zakama Primal Calamity, because making all of his activated abilities 1 mana is very solid. But honestly, one of the coolest new commanders for Zerda is Captain America, First Avenger. Making his equipment unattach ability 1 mana along with the equipment's already having activated abilities that Zerda reduces makes him a super solid pickup. This combo is super cool and awesome, and it sure would be a shame if one of the most mishandled secret lair drops in recent history prevented a large swath of the player base to be unable to play with this cool commander companion combo without resorting to proxying, now wouldn't it? Next up is Kahira, the Orphan's Guard. For 1 generic and 2 green-white hybrid mana, you get a 3/2 with Vigilance who gives each other creature you control that's a cat, elemental, nightmare, dinosaur, or beast +1/+1 in Vigilance, which is good because your companion requirement is that each creature card in your deck is a cat, elemental, nightmare, dinosaur, or beast. Oddly enough, Kahira is the most boring companion in my opinion because their requirement is so open. Are you playing a Kindred deck in green and white that has any of these creature types? Then you maybe can cut a few of the utility creatures and run Kahira. It's fine, but I think we can do a bit better. Personally, I think we can run Kahira in a deck with Tayam, Luminous, Enigma to brew up something truly enigmatic. And I mean, this idea is very mean. Tayam is 1, a white, a black, and a green for a 3/3 Nightmare Beast who makes all of your other creatures come into play with a Vigilance counter on them. Then we can pay 3 generic mana and remove 3 counters in total from creatures we control to mill 3 cards and get a permanent card back from the graveyard as long as the mana value is 3 or less. We can then combo this with some powerful, cheap creatures that fit Kahira's requirement, like Kutsil, Malamed Exemplar, Miri, Weatherlight Duelist, and Sky Hunter Strike Force. I swear this isn't a cat deck in disguise, it's just a coincidence. This lets us win in a combination of combat and control, and also might make people very upset. Time to plunder our opponent's graveyards with Gyruda, Doom of Depths. This tentacled terror is 4 generic and 2 blue-black hybrid mana for a massive 6/6 Demon Kraken with a pretty steep companion requirement. Every single card in your deck must be even. Yes, These decks live in perpetual fear of a Void Winter, but I'll get into some ways to circumvent this in a bit because we still have a doozy of an ability here. When Gyruda comes into play, everyone mills 4 cards and you put a creature card with an even mana value from among the milled cards onto the battlefield under your control. While this means you'll need to get a little bit lucky to hit something off your opponents, we can put our even-costed big boys into play with no problem. So before I talk about synergies with a commander, let's take a look at that restriction for a moment. Being restricted to even-cost cards is a little bit rough, but there's something important to remember about deck building requirements for companions. They are very shallow. And by that I mean they only look at the surface level of the card. It'll be a little bit more relevant on a later companion, but say if you want to play a modal phase double card or a card with an adventure, such as Valky God of Lies or Altar of Baal, the only thing you need to worry about is the initial mana value, meaning we can kinda play some odd cost cards while only playing even mana values. One of the great options here for Gyruda decks is Spellscorn Coven and their adventure half, Take It Back. It's an extra soft counterspell that has a little bit of extra value in making our opponents discard a card later on. As for commanders for Gyruda, there's more than a few options, but I think a commander that ties into these reanimation themes is the Ancient One. It's a blue and a black for an 8/8, but before you start typing an angry comment saying how magic is dead, this fella can't attack or block unless you have a whopping 8 permanent cards in your graveyard, which won't be too hard in a deck like this, but still, it is a requirement. The Ancient One has an activated ability for 2, a blue and a black, to draw a card and discard a card, and mill someone based on the discard card's mana value. So if we draw the big monsters we put in before our reanimation spells, we can use the Ancient One to get them into the graveyard and get that Descendate requirement fulfilled and make our opponent's life totals descend into the dirt. Next up is the big hippo herself, Keruga, the Macro Sage. She's 3 generic mana and 2 blue-green hybrid mana for a 5/4 dinosaur hippo with the companion rule that every non-land card in your deck has to have a converted mana value of 3 or more. Another companion that's allergic to Soul Ring, but the effect is really worth it. When Keruga comes into play, you draw a card for each permanent you control whose mana value is 3 or greater. Keruga is simple and the decks are a bit more generic. Having your limit be only expensive cards in the format of goofy expensive cards isn't a huge problem, but if we want to push this even further, we can play Keruga with Animar, Soul of the Elements. For one, having a companion that says we can only play cards that are 3 or higher means that a lot of Animar's potential infinite combos are off the table, but not all of them. So it gives us a little bit of leeway with opponents who might know Animar's potential to sneeze and accidentally go infinite. But also, Animar's ability lets us reduce our big creature's costs, letting us draw more cards with Keruga when she finally comes down. As the great Sir Mix-a-Lot once said, I'm pretty sure, I appreciate large posteriors and I cannot tell a fabrication. It's time to be a little odd with Obosh the Prey Piercer. This Helion horror is 3 generic mana and 2 red-black hybrid mana for a 3/5 with quite the odd companion requirement. I swear this is the last time I use that joke, please don't leave. Every single non-land card in your deck has to be an odd mana value of card, which like Gyruda is an extremely restrictive condition, but the payoff is amazing. If a source that's odd, as in an odd mana value, deals damage to a player or permanent, it deals double that damage. In terms of cards that do well here, there are so many. For one, any odd mana cost creature just deals double damage, and cards like Blood for the Blood God and Karavek the Merciless deal massive damage to your opponents and can just end games really quick. As for commanders, one of the most interesting options for deck building is Vial Smasher the Fierce. If you've sat across from a group slug player, you've definitely seen Vial Smasher, but Vial Smasher is able to slot in different odd cost partners based on how evil you want to be. You could play Jessica to do a lot of damage, doubling on top of the tripling. You could use Ludwig to have a little bit of card draw. You could use Galanra to ramp. There's plenty of options here for evil criminal activity. Ooh, we're at my favorite companion. It's Umori the Collector. For 2 generic and 2 black-green hybrid mana, you get a 4/5 ooze with one of the most stringent restrictions of any of the companions. Each non-land card in your deck must share a card type, which will come in handy when she comes into play, because you can choose a card type and all of those cards cost 1 less mana to cast. The first thing a lot of people think when it comes to Umori is, well, creature-only decks, and honestly that's fair. Creatures are good, and a lot of commanders happen to be creatures. It's almost like it's a rule or something, like having a legendary creature as your commander, like, you know, if you're gonna go that route, I'd look at creatures like Yarok the Desecrated or Horde of Notions, two commanders who want to have a lot of creatures and could probably sacrifice playing Soul Ring and powerful instants and sorceries. But my favorite commander for this companion is the new Rindamal Creaking Nest. Being able to pick artifacts or creatures and getting the benefit to casting both? I love this card so much, and honestly, I could make a whole video on the different ways you can build with Omori. I love this companion so much, and love how many different ways you get to play with it. Finally, we're getting jeggy with it with Jegantha the Wellspring. While the mana cost of this companion is 4 generic and 1 red-green hybrid, Jeggy is, unfortunately, only available for 5 killer decks because of her powerful mana ability. Jegantha can tap to add a white, blue, black, red, and green mana to your mana pool, but that mana can't be spent on generic costs, which, oddly enough, means Jegantha can't cast itself, but honestly we don't need to worry about that. While the massive mana ability is powerful, the companion ability is pretty restrictive too, at least in Commander. It was so easy in other formats that Jeggy is banned in Modern right now, but in Commander, the restriction of no card being able to have 2 of the same mana symbol in its cost is rough. As an example, you can't run Counterspell since it has 2 blue pips up in the top right, but you can play Arcane Denial since it's only 1 blue pip. 5-color commanders are a bit more common nowadays, but finding ones that synergize with Jegantha is a bit rough. For example, Morophon is a little bit awkward since Jegantha can't help us cast Morophon. Dragon can be reduced in cost, but a lot of the dragons that are extremely powerful have 2 red at a minimum, and Garth One-Eye can't cast Shivan Dragon with Jeggy's mana ability, so he's effectively useless. For my money, I think Omnath, Locus of All, is one of the best commanders to go with Jeggy. He wants you to have 3 mana pips in your spells, all of which Jegantha can play really well with. And, as it turns out, you can still use the cool Stoplight in the deck even if Jegantha can't cast it or use the Replicate ability, which is rad. I like the Stoplight. With all of that being said, companions were a complicated mechanic that would take a lot of work and care to come back to, so obviously a cartoon woman is going to try her best and figure out a way that they really could come back as a mechanic. For one, I think it would need to be printed in exclusively a commander set, either in precons or a draft set like Battle for Baldur's Gate. Don't print these into bigger constructed formats, it's just a bad idea. For 2, I think making the body itself a little bit cheaper to compensate for the actual tax might be a little bit more palatable. I'd also try to give them flash to set off the initial cost of paying 3 mana to get the companion into your hand. Finally, more creative restrictions would be interesting. For example, maybe only allowing certain card types like Umori, but excluding the commander so that you could play a mono artifact deck or a mono enchantment deck with a neat payoff in the companion zone would be a little bit better. I used to dabble a little bit in custom card design, but honestly, I'd need to spend a lot of time crafting a new set of companions, and I'm not entirely sure you guys would want to see my goofy custom card designs. If you do, let me know. Personally, while I'd love to see a new set of companions printed, I think the ones we have are really interesting and creative, and they're enough to scratch the itch in my brain that needs those kind of effects. But tell me, what do you think about companions? Do you think they're the greatest mistake that's ever plagued Magic the Gathering, or do you think they're just a bunch of little misunderstood little cuties? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thank you all so very much for watching, and until next time, au revoir!